April 18th, 1942. 12:15 p.m. Tokyo time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the first wave at Pearl Harbor just 133 days earlier, stood frozen on the tarmac of Kisarazu Air Base, watching a twin-engine bomber with unfamiliar silhouettes roar overhead at 1,500 feet. The mathematics were impossible. His mind, trained in every specification of American military aircraft, rejected what his eyes were seeing. That was a North American B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber with a maximum range of 1,350 miles. The nearest American territory capable of launching such aircraft was Midway Island, over 2,400 miles away. The nearest American carrier capable of carrying B-25s didn't exist. The bomber was too large, too heavy, and required too much runway. Yet there it was, dropping incendiary clusters on the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, while air raid sirens wailed across the imperial capital for the first time in 2,600 years of Japanese history. What Fuchida didn't know, what none of the 220 million citizens of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere could have imagined, was that those 16 bombers with their 64 crewmen would accomplish something that no military force had managed in centuries. Force the Imperial Japanese Navy to abandon its carefully calculated strategy and commit to a battle it couldn't afford to lose. Within 47 days, the psychological shock of this moment would lead directly to Midway, where Japan's dream of Pacific dominance would die in 5 catastrophic minutes. The raid itself would destroy less than 0.01% of Tokyo's structures and kill fewer than 100 people. But the strategic earthquake it triggered would reshape the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. This is the story of how 80 American volunteers in obsolete medium bombers achieved what entire armies couldn't. They made the Japanese military abandon logic, abandon caution, and rush headlong toward their own destruction. The seeds of strategic disaster were planted at 3:10 a.m. on April 18th, when the Japanese picket boat Nidomaru No. 23, stationed 650 miles off the Japanese coast, radioed an urgent message to naval headquarters. 3 enemy carriers sighted. The message was transmitted just before the USS Nashville's guns reduced the fishing vessel to splinters, but the damage was done. Admiral William Halsey, commanding Task Force 16 from the carrier USS Enterprise, knew immediately that Surprise was compromised. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a 45-year-old MIT aeronautical engineer who held both a doctorate in engineering and a reputation as the most skilled pilot in America, had trained his 16 B-25 crews for a launch point 450 miles from Japan. At 650 miles, the mathematics changed catastrophically. Fuel that would have been sufficient to reach the Chinese coast with 200 miles of safety margin was now almost certainly insufficient. The mission, planned as a one-way trip to China, had just become a probable death sentence. At 8:20 a.m., 170 miles farther from Japan than any test launch had ever been attempted, with the USS Hornet's deck pitching violently in 30-foot seas and 47-knot headwinds, Doolittle's B-25B lifted off the carrier with just 5 feet of deck to spare. His 5,200-pound bomb load and 1,141 gallons of fuel brought his total takeoff weight to 31,000 pounds, 9,000 pounds over the bomber's designed carrier launch weight. 15 more B-25s followed in 72 minutes, each pilot watching the Hornet's bow rise and fall, timing their throttles to catch the upward pitch that would give them an extra precious seconds of lift. What Japanese naval intelligence didn't know at that moment would prove catastrophic. They assumed the American task force, compromised so far from the coast, would retreat immediately. No rational admiral would risk two precious fleet carriers merely to launch a nuisance raid. The Imperial General Staff calculated that enemy carriers at 650 miles posed no threat. Their normal striking radius with loaded bombers was approximately 300 miles. The mathematics seemed to guarantee safety. But Doolittle's B-25s weren't carrier aircraft optimized for returning to floating runways. They were land-based medium bombers, stripped of every non-essential component, modified with additional fuel tanks in spaces where tail gunners usually sat, and crewed by volunteers who had trained for 6 weeks at Eglin Field, Florida, to perform carrier launches that military doctrine considered impossible. The first B-25 appeared over Tokyo at 12:15 p.m., flying so low that civilians on the streets could see Captain Ted Lawson's face in the cockpit. Within the next 30 minutes, all 16 aircraft would strike targets across an 800-mile corridor. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. The industrial heart of the Japanese Empire. The ordnance delivered totaled 16,000 pounds. Incendiary clusters, 500-pound demolition bombs, and specially modified 500-pound incendiary bombs filled with a new chemical compound that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The material damage was minimal. 50 buildings destroyed, 252 damaged, 12 civilians killed, approximately 50 wounded. Several fuel tanks at the Yokosuka arsenal ignited. A warehouse in Nagoya burned. A crane at Kobe Harbor was damaged. In military terms, the raid was tactically insignificant, less destructive than a single night of what would later become routine B-29 operations. But the psychological impact detonated like a nuclear weapon in the corridors of Japanese military command. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, aboard the battleship Yamato in Hashirajima anchorage, learned of the raid while in conference with his staff regarding the second phase of Pacific operations. His immediate response, documented in the diary of his Chief of Staff, Admiral Matome Ugaki, was a single question. How did they get through? The answer was unacceptable. The picket line of 50 converted fishing boats, stationed in concentric arcs 600 to 700 miles off the coast, had successfully detected the enemy. Japanese radar installations, primitive compared to American or British systems but functional, had tracked incoming aircraft. Fighter squadrons had been alerted and scrambled. And yet, 16 enemy bombers penetrated to the capital, bombed the Imperial Palace district, and escaped without a single shootdown. 0 losses, 0 captures. Complete success. The raid exposed a vulnerability that contradicted 3 years of Japanese military propaganda. Since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese people had been told that their island homeland was inviolate, protected by divine wind, kamikaze, and the invincible Imperial Navy. Schoolchildren practiced air raid drills as bureaucratic formality, confident that no enemy would ever reach Japanese skies. The military high command had promised absolute defense of the home islands. Doolittle's raiders shattered that promise in 30 minutes. The political consequences within Japanese leadership were immediate and severe. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had personally assured Emperor Hirohito that the homeland would remain secure, faced the first serious challenge to his authority since taking office in October 1941. The emperor himself, traditionally insulated from military operations, directly questioned the military command about the raid's success. Palace officials reported that Hirohito, normally reserved and formal, expressed what contemporary observers described as imperial displeasure. the most severe criticism possible within the hierarchical structure of Japanese governance. Yamamoto's strategic position within Naval Command, already complicated by his opposition to unlimited war with America, became more precarious. He had predicted at the outset of war that Japan had 6 months to a year to achieve decisive victories before American industrial capacity overwhelmed Japanese gains. The Doolittle raid occurred at month 5 of that window, and it demonstrated something Yamamoto had feared, that American resourcefulness and determination would find ways to strike back regardless of apparent mathematical impossibilities. The immediate military response revealed the depth of Japanese strategic panic. On April 19th, less than 24 hours after the raid, Imperial General Headquarters issued Emergency Defense Order No. 18, restructuring the entire home defense system. 2 full fighter groups, approximately 200 aircraft, were immediately withdrawn from offensive operations in China and the Southwest Pacific to establish permanent home defense squadrons. These weren't reserve units or training aircraft. They were frontline combat groups led by experienced pilots who were desperately needed at the expanding perimeter. The redeployment represented a strategic loss of catastrophic proportions. Every fighter diverted to home defense was one fighter not available for the coming operations at Port Moresby, the Solomon Islands, or the Aleutians. Japan's industrial capacity could produce approximately 800 fighter aircraft per month. Respectable, but far below American production of 2,100. Committing 200 frontline fighters to defend against an attack method that had occurred once might never occur again, and had caused minimal damage was strategically irrational. But rationality had been compromised by psychological shock. The raid hadn't just damaged buildings. It had damaged the fundamental assumption underlying Japanese grand strategy, that the Pacific was so vast that America couldn't project power across it fast enough to prevent Japan from consolidating its gains behind an impregnable defensive perimeter. This assumption drove what came next. On May 1, 1942, Admiral Yamamoto formally presented his MI operation plan to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The plan called for an assault on Midway Island, a barren coral atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, that served as the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto's strategic logic was straightforward. Occupy Midway. Draw out the American carrier fleet in defense of this vital position, and destroy the carriers in decisive battle. Without carriers, America would be incapable of offensive operations for at least 2 years. Enough time for Japan to fortify the perimeter and negotiate a favorable peace from a position of strength. The Naval General Staff had previously rejected this plan in favor of a southward advance toward Australia. Cutting the supply line between America and Australia, the staff argued, would isolate General Douglas MacArthur's forces and potentially force Australia's withdrawal from the war. The plan was methodical, achievable, and aligned with Japan's resource limitations. But the Doolittle raid changed everything. The Naval General Staff's objections evaporated. The careful arguments for resource conservation and methodical expansion were swept aside by a single imperative: protect the homeland by pushing the defensive perimeter eastward. Midway became psychologically mandatory. The Americans had demonstrated they could launch carriers against Japan. The only solution was to eliminate the American carriers before they could do it again. What the Japanese command didn't know, couldn't know, was that American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese JN-25 naval code to understand both the target and the approximate timing of Yamamoto's planned operation. The Americans knew Midway was the target. They knew late May or early June was the time frame. They knew the order of battle would include multiple carrier divisions. The Japanese plan depended entirely on achieving surprise. It assumed the American carriers would be in Pearl Harbor or patrolling the South Pacific when the attack commenced, giving Japanese forces time to occupy Midway and establish defenses before the Americans could respond. Admiral Chester Nimitz would supposedly have to rush his carriers 1,300 miles to engage a prepared Japanese force in defensive positions, a scenario heavily favoring Japan. Instead, Nimitz positioned his carriers in an ambush point 200 miles northeast of Midway, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range, but perfectly positioned to strike the Japanese carrier force while it was engaged in the Midway attack. The mathematical advantage shifted 180 degrees. The Japanese would be attacking with ordnance optimized for ground targets. The Americans would be attacking with ordnance optimized for anti-shipping. On June 4, 1942, 47 days after Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, the Battle of Midway began at 6:30 a.m. when 108 Japanese aircraft launched from 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, to strike Midway Island. At 7:05 a.m., American scout planes located the Japanese carrier force. At 9:25 a.m., while Japanese carriers were in the most vulnerable possible position, decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, some just returned from Midway, others being prepared for a strike against the located American carriers. American dive bombers appeared through the clouds at 14,000 feet. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed. Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship, and the carrier that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack. Kaga, veteran of the China campaign. Soryu, freshly modernized. All 3 transformed into floating infernos, their hangar decks filled with aviation fuel, bombs, and torpedoes that created chain reaction explosions. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, would be destroyed by evening. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 personnel, including many of the most experienced carrier pilots in the Imperial Navy. American losses: 1 carrier, USS Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 personnel. The exchange rate was catastrophic for Japan, approximately 10-1 in Japan's disfavor, when measured by strategic value. The Japanese Navy that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months was effectively destroyed as an offensive force in 1 day of combat. Japan would never again conduct major carrier operations offensively. The Midway disaster forced a complete strategic reversal, from offensive expansion to desperate defense. And it happened because Japanese leadership abandoned their careful pre-war planning to address a psychological threat rather than a material one. The connection to Doolittle's raid wasn't subtle or theoretical. Admiral Ugaki's diary entries from April 19th to June 5th explicitly link the 2 events. On April 19th, he wrote, "The shame of being unable to defend our capital requires immediate action. All offensive operations must be accelerated to prevent repetition." On May 5th, after the MI plan was approved, "The enemy's audacity must be punished. Midway will show them that the combined fleet controls the Pacific." On June 5th, after Midway's disaster, "We rushed to recover face and lost everything. The American carriers that bombed Tokyo have destroyed the fleet at Midway." The causal chain was direct and documented. The raid created psychological pressure that overrode strategic logic. The psychological pressure led to the Midway operation being approved over better alternatives. The Midway operation led to the carrier's destruction. The carrier's destruction led to Japan losing the strategic initiative permanently. But the story of the Doolittle raid's impact didn't end at Midway. The long-term strategic consequences rippled through the rest of the Pacific War in ways that multiplied the initial damage. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and their irreplaceable air groups meant Japan could never again conduct the kind of multi-carrier offensive operations that had characterized the war's first 6 months. Japanese industry could build carrier hulls. They would complete several during the war. But they couldn't replace the experienced pilots lost at Midway. The Japanese pilot training system, which emphasized long, intensive training to produce elite aviators, couldn't scale quickly enough. American pilot training, which emphasized standardized techniques and rapid throughput, produced 10,000 new carrier pilots per year by 1943. The defensive perimeter that Japan had stretched outward to prevent another Tokyo raid became indefensible. At Midway, Japanese forces had attempted to simultaneously occupy the Western Aleutians, part of the AL operation, while attacking Midway, the MI operation. The Aleutians occupation succeeded. Japanese forces took Attu and Kiska Islands, but these positions were so remote and so exposed that they consumed resources without providing strategic benefit. By August 1943, after spending 15 months and thousands of troops to defend these barren rocks, Japan would abandon them without achieving any objective beyond demonstrating that they had extended the perimeter. The China Front, which had absorbed the majority of Japanese military resources since 1937, became exponentially more costly after Doolittle's raiders landed in China. The fact that American bombers had received assistance from Chinese civilians and military forces in reaching safety, despite 13 of the 16 bombers crashing or being abandoned due to fuel exhaustion, triggered a savage Japanese response. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign, launched in May 1942, saw Japanese forces systematically destroy any Chinese village suspected of assisting the American raiders. The estimated death toll from this retribution campaign ranges from 250,000 to 300,000 Chinese civilians and soldiers, killed through conventional military action, biological warfare experimentation, and deliberate starvation tactics. Entire villages were burned, wells were poisoned, crops were destroyed. The brutality was so extreme that even some Japanese officers documented their concerns in post-war testimonies, noting that the operation seemed designed more for punishment than military necessity. This campaign consumed resources Japan desperately needed elsewhere. 6 divisions, approximately 100,000 troops, were committed to operations in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, when those forces were needed to defend against the American advance through the Solomon Islands. The campaign also poisoned any remaining possibility of Chinese collaboration with Japan's co-prosperity sphere propaganda, ensuring that Chinese resistance would remain fierce and uncompromising for the remainder of the war. The strategic paranoia triggered by the raid manifested in other wasteful directions. Japanese civil defense preparations escalated dramatically. Millions of man-hours were diverted to digging bomb shelters, establishing fire prevention zones, and drilling civilian populations in air raid procedures. Industrial facilities were dispersed and hardened, reducing production efficiency. Critical industries were relocated to Manchuria and Korea to place them beyond American bomber range, a precaution that would prove useless once B-29 superfortresses entered service in 1944. Perhaps most significantly, the raid crystallized in Yamamoto's mind that the war could only be won through decisive battle. not through the methodical consolidation strategy that had been working. After Midway, even as the strategic situation deteriorated, Yamamoto continued to seek that decisive engagement that would restore Japanese initiative. In April 1943, during a morale-boosting tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands, his aircraft was intercepted and shot down by American P-38 fighters, whose mission was made possible by decoded Japanese communications. His death removed the one senior naval officer who might have advocated a more cautious defensive strategy. By late 1943, American industrial production had reached levels that retrospectively make Japanese defeat seem inevitable. But in April 1942, that outcome wasn't certain. Japan controlled territory from the Indian Ocean to the mid-Pacific, possessed a qualitative advantage in naval aviation, and had demonstrated superior night fighting capabilities. A patient, defensive strategy focusing on fortifying the inner perimeter and draining American will to fight was viable. American public opinion in mid-1942 was far from certain about prosecuting a multi-year war of attrition. The Doolittle raid's psychological impact destroyed that option. It forced Japan to gamble on decisive victory instead of betting on patient defense. The gamble failed at Midway, and from that point forward, every Japanese strategic decision was reactive rather than proactive, responding to American initiatives rather than pursuing Japanese objectives. The 16 B-25s delivered approximately 16,000 pounds of ordnance to Japanese targets. In comparison, a single B-29 raid in 1945 would deliver 4 million pounds, 250 times as much. The physical damage of the Doolittle raid was militarily negligible, but those 16 bombers forced a strategic overreaction that led directly to the destruction of Japan's carrier force, which led to the loss of strategic initiative, which led to the defensive battles of attrition that Japan couldn't win, which led ultimately to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and unconditional surrender. The mathematics of strategic cause and effect were devastating. 16 bombers triggered a response that committed 4 fleet carriers to a battle where they were destroyed, which eliminated Japan's ability to conduct offensive carrier operations, which meant Japan couldn't prevent the American advance through the Central Pacific, which meant American bombers eventually gained the range to reduce Japanese cities to ash from bases in the Marianas, which led to Japan's complete defeat. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle, who received the Medal of Honor for leading the raid, spent much of his life modestly deflecting credit. "We inflicted practically no damage," he would say in interviews. "We accomplished next to nothing militarily." What he understood, but rarely emphasized, was that strategic impact isn't measured in tons of bombs dropped or buildings destroyed. It's measured in enemy decisions forced, resources diverted, and strategic alternatives eliminated. The raid forced Japan to defend everywhere, which meant they couldn't defend anywhere adequately. It forced acceleration of operations that needed careful planning. It forced commitment to battles they couldn't afford to lose. It forced, ultimately, Japan's military leadership to abandon the logic that might have saved them and embrace the emotion that guaranteed their destruction. In the end, the Doolittle raid's greatest weapon wasn't the incendiary bombs carried in B-25 bomb bays. It was the fear it planted in Japanese strategic consciousness. The fear that America's vast industrial capacity and improvisational genius meant that no defensive perimeter was truly safe, no calculation was reliable, and no victory was permanent. That fear drove Japan to Midway. Midway drove Japan to defeat. And it all began with Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's B-25 lifting off the USS Hornet with 5 feet of deck to spare and fuel that probably wouldn't reach China. April 18, 1942. 12:15 p.m. Tokyo time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida stood frozen on that tarmac, watching the impossible bomber roar overhead. He didn't know it then, but he was witnessing the beginning of the end. The bomber dropped its ordnance and disappeared into the spring sky, leaving behind negligible damage and catastrophic consequences. Within 47 days, the psychological earthquake it triggered would destroy Japan's carrier force at Midway. Within 3 years, that force's absence would allow American bombers to burn Japan's cities until surrender became the only option. All because 16 bombers did what Japanese mathematics said was impossible. All because Japan responded to that impossibility with panic instead of reason. All because fear proved more destructive than any bomb. Commander Fuchida survived the war and eventually emigrated to America, where he spent years analyzing the strategic decisions that led to Japan's defeat. In a 1963 interview, he was asked about the moment he saw Doolittle's bomber over Tokyo. "I knew immediately," he said, "that we had already lost. Not because of those bombs, but because of what those bombs would make us do. We would chase them. We would try to punish the audacity. We would commit to battle we shouldn't fight, at a place we shouldn't fight, against an enemy that wanted us to fight there. I knew all this in that moment. But knowing didn't matter. The decision had already been made by the simple fact that they had reached us. The raid accomplished what no military operation could. It made us abandon wisdom for pride. 30 minutes of bombing," he concluded. 47 days to disaster. 3 years to defeat. That is the true measure of the Doolittle raid. Fuchida was right. The bombers that appeared over Tokyo for 30 minutes in April 1942 cast a shadow that reached all the way to September 1945. Not through the damage they caused, but through the fear they inspired. Not through their bombs, but through the strategic panic their existence triggered. 80 American volunteers and 16 obsolete medium bombers achieved what entire armies couldn't. They made the Japanese military commit suicide strategically, rushing toward battle that would guarantee their destruction. The thunder had spoken over Tokyo, and in answering, Japan sealed its fate. The raid didn't just shock Japan into realizing Americans were beginning to fight. It shocked Japan into ensuring Americans would win.